Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to It Says What, where JW3 and Limmud come together to bring you unexpected and poignant Jewish content every week from across the Jewish community before Shabbat. I'm Joe Hyman, JW3's young programmer, and JW3, if you haven't met us, we are the UK's Jewish Community and Arts Centre. We're partnering to bring you this content with Limmud, a diverse and inclusive worldwide community of Jewish learning. If you haven't seen, JW3 is open. We're open to the public. Please come and visit us, see Ashley Blaker on Sunday evening. And if you're not ready to come out, please join us on our big night in on Thursday night with a star-studded cast of various different performers from across the entertainment industry coming together to support JW3 and have an incredible night of entertainment and joy. This series will ask educators and leaders from across the Jewish community in the UK and abroad to share a surprising piece of Jewish wisdom. To ask your own questions, please comment on Facebook, YouTube, or in the webinar itself, and we'll take them towards the end. I'm delighted to welcome Sina Kahen, the author of the recently published book, Ideas, Bereshit Edition, which is a series of essays on the weekly Torah portions through the intellectual lens of the Western Sephardi approach. His full-time work is in the AI industry, the artificial intelligence industry. That's pretty interesting to have those mixed together, and that's why we were very excited to have Sina here today. And his part-time work involves public speaking and writings on topics ranging from the future of healthcare, the ethics of artificial intelligence, and anti-superstitious Judaism. So lots and lots of things to talk about. Welcome, Sina. How are you?
I'm doing great, Joe. Thank you very much for having me. Fantastic series. Really, really excited to be part of it. And thank you for the kind introduction.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you. So tell us, what's the text you'll be sharing that makes you say, it says what?
Yes, it really did. It made me say, it says what? It made me want to really explore the roots of my Sephardi heritage and see what the context of it really was. And this text is basically, it's actually a ban. It's a statement that was made by Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, who is the Rashba, one of the leading authorities in Europe, in the world, really leading Jewish authorities. And it was recorded in a book, Minhat Qanaot, which was a book put together that essentially addressed and included a lot of the letters that were going back and forth during controversial period of time in medieval Jewish history, which we'll be digging into. And this ban is on a number of topics, on a number of books. It's essentially a ban on a whole worldview. And I think the reason why it really stood out to me was because I see the ramifications of a ban like this. A lot of people don't know about the counter ban to it, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we hear or we feel or we see some of the remnants of this worldview or of the kind of ideology that led the great Rashba to write something like this. We see it today in certain circles, certain areas. So digging into it, hopefully will provide some very interesting context on some of the challenges that took place, not only in medieval Jewish history, but I would argue that really take place today in Judaism. So I'm going to dig in. I'm going to go through, split it up into different sections, and then from there we'll go in through some of the context. Now it starts here. Vegazarnu vekibalnu alenu ve'al zarenu ve'al hanilvim alenu bekoach hacherem. We have decreed and accepted upon ourselves and our progeny and those who are joined to us with the force of a ban. Leval yilmod ish mibnei kahalenu besifrei hayavanim asher chibru b'chokhmat hateva v'chokhmat ha'elohut. That no individual from among the members of our community should study the works of the Greeks that they composed on natural science, such as physics, divine science, metaphysics. Ben hamechubarim bilshonam ben shehuetku belashon acher meyom va'ad 50 shana ad hayoto ben 5 ve'esrim shana. Whether they were written in their own language, whether these books were translated to another language, from this day forward for the next 50 years until the person has reached 25 years of age. Veshelo lilamed ish mibnei ka'alenu et echad מבני ישראל בחוכמות האלו עד הישיהו בני 25 שנה. And no member of our community should teach one of the children of Israel these sciences until they are 25 years old. And this is the real it says what section. מחויבים כל ישראל להחרימם ולנדותם. All of Israel is required to excommunicate these sinners. ולא יכפר להם העוון הזה עד ימותון אש של גיהינום קלה בגופם של אלו והאש לא נפח אש לא תכבה נתון. Until their death, they shall not atone for this transgression. The fire of Gehinnom will be extinguished, but the bodies of these sinners will not be consumed. Upon their bodies, the flame will never go out. Now you read something like this, and you think, what's going on? what deserves such, strong language from one of the leading authorities of the time? And it really cuts to the core of how we refer to our Judaism, to our understanding of Torah, and at the end of the day, to the reality that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that God has, provided for us. So I'd like to go to some of the context, if that's okay, and to kind of see what happened in the years prior to this ban being established. And we have to remember, once we've been exiled from Babylonia, thanks to Nebuchadnezzar, the Jews really went to different areas. So the Talmud Bavli was established by the Gaonim, the last leading figures of Babylonian Jewry. Many went to Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, and obviously many went to the lands of Ashkenaz, so the Franco-German Rhineland, and others went eastwards. For me, the most important part for this discussion is with regards to the two groups, one that went obviously to the Iberian Peninsula, so this Spain, if you like, and one that went to the Franco-German Rhineland, which essentially became the future Sephardim and the Ashkenazim. Now, those that were in Sepharad, in Spain, because of Sepharad, the word itself means Spanish. Now, there's two areas of Spain, really, that are, for all intents and purposes, different countries, different cultures. We already know from Catalonia how they want to separate from Spain, because they're very, very different from the rest of the Spanish land. So you have northern Spain, which is obviously on the border of the Franco-German Rhineland, and then you have southern Spain, which is Andalusia, and that is separate and away from that northern influence, if you like, from Franco-German Rhineland. And in Ashkenaz, you have, obviously, in the Franco-German Rhineland, Jews that had arrived there after exile from Babylonia. In 1147, so we're talking about, after a good while that the Jews have been in Andalusia, the Sephardim had to leave Andalusia because there were new Muslim rulers in town who were extremely radical. And these Sephardim had to end up migrating to lands of Ashkenaz, southern France, to be precise. It's called Languedoc, the land of Occitania. Provence is one of the areas within that region. And this region of southern France was to become the latest conflict, but one of the biggest conflict that still occurs today between ideologies that were originally known as Sephardi and Ashkenazi, but today are known as integrationist versus isolationist. And these Sephardi arrivals from Andalusia, we have to remember what context they were moving from, what environment they were coming from. They are known to come from the most sophisticated Jewish community in the world at the time. Their Torah was rooted, their Hachamim were rooted, or they had a predilection for rationality, for worldly knowledge, for tradition, authority, very much connected to the Gaonic culture that developed the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. So it wasn't something that was essentially innovated within the borders of Andalusia. It was something that they believed was the Mesorah, the tradition that they brought from the Gaonim. And their Hachamim, their leading rabbis, if we think from Yitzchak Alfazi, the Rif, who's so fundamental to the Shulchan Aruch, as one of the opinions, Rambam, Shlomo ibn Gabirol, Yehuda Halevi, a lot of these Hachamim of Sepharad, they were involved in so many different aspects of God's reality at the end of the day. That's how they saw it. So they were doctors, scientists, poets, philosophers, writing treatises on logic, held high positions, being in charge of the Grenadian army, being in charge of the army in Toledo. So these were Hachamim who if we think about it, they were very much embedded in the cutting edge reality of their time, but at the same time, uncompromising in their halakha and in their understanding of, Torah. And they really found reason and revelation rooted in the same source. And they were from this Spanish environment, this Andalusian environment, which was, as I said, the cutting edge, not just for Jews, but in the world. A lot of the philosophical and scientific thinking was really born out of the Arabic translations that were taking place in Andalusia, thanks to Muslims who were translating the Greek, the most cutting edge Greek works into Arabic. And the Jews, the Hachamim, had access to this information, which for them was not even considered Aristotelian or this or that. It was just considered the cutting edge knowledge about understanding the reality that they believed HaKadosh Baruch Hu created. So these Sephardi arrivals arrived, and they have this Mesorah, this tradition, and we have just a couple of lines of what these Hachamim really thought. So Rambam, the apprehension of God cannot come about except through metaphysics. And this metaphysics, understanding, cannot come about except after a study of natural science. A human being has to set himself aside to come to understand through understanding science, the world, things that teach him about God to the maximum that a human being is capable of. Rabbeinu Bahya ibn Pachuda, another giant. Those who neglect philosophy are lazy, and they have contempt for the word of God and his halakha, his law. Another one, Hakam Yaakov Anatoli. What branch of human wisdom is there that can be ignored in our efforts to arrive at a fuller knowledge of God? When one scales the heights of natural science, be sure that at the summit you will find God. So you can see what this Sephardi worldview really was as they were coming into this southern French Ashkenazi region. Now, what were the Ashkenazim like? What was the culture like? And we see that it was essentially a very primitive, culturally unproductive environment as a result of the Christian influence in the country. Because remember, the Andalusian Jews were, I wouldn't say the product, but they were enjoying the fruits that the Islamic culture, which was very worldly, had essentially produced. But the Ashkenazim were living amongst Christians who were very Gnostic, very, very thinking primitively. Very little knowledge of philosophy did these Ashkenazi Hachamim have. Giants in the world of Talmud and Torah, just like the Hachamim of Sepharad were. But again, they didn't have access to a lot of the books on cutting edge knowledge because they weren't translated to these, for all intents and purposes, these Ashkenazim didn't have the understanding of Arabic to be able to learn these Greek works of philosophy and natural science and metaphysics. So they were almost sidelined as a result, not because of their own doing, as a result of the environment they were in. And they were very hesitant about the outside world. We had just had, Rhineland massacres 100 years prior. So they were very, very hesitant to mix with the outside world. And their scholars were very Torah only. And they were very good at writing commentaries on commentaries. And if you just see some of the kind of worldview of the Ashkenazim of the time, you really understand from their quotes relative to what I just said about the Sephardim. This is the Rosh, as we know, one of the giants of Ashkenaz. Whoever would enter from the beginning into the sciences will never escape from it. He will never grasp the wisdom of halakha, which is the paths of life, since his heart will always be with these sciences. Sciences and the law are mutually exclusive and are not compatible with one another. I do not know your secular knowledge, he's speaking to Sephardim. Blessed be the Lord who saved me from it. The sign and proof is that it will apostatize men from fear of God and from his law. So you can see the kind of feeling towards worldly knowledge. So why did this occur with regards to Sephardim and Ashkenazim? It's got to do with the role of the environment. At the end of the day, as I mentioned, in Spain, the competition was very cultural and intellectual. You had the Muslims offering the best of, intellect, reasoning, culture. So the competition there for the Jews was, how can we compete in being intellectual? So intellect is the image of God within us that it says in Bereshit, Tselem Elokim. Let's see who can be most intellectual in their apprehension of God. In Ashkenaz, in the Franco-German Rhineland, the competition was with regards to religious devotion. So the Ashkenazi pietists, they were basically trying to demonstrate that they would not be put to shame by the Christian zealots in the service of God. Because the Christian zealots, very ascetic lifestyle, very demonological, very much about, suffering as a result of showing your suffering as a way of showing your commitment to God. So it's very much the role of environment that dictated these two differing hashkafic outlooks. So they arrive in southern France, these Sephardim, and the tension is huge because you've got this newly arrived scientific and philosophical learning of Sepharad meeting this indigenous rabbinic culture of Ashkenaz, which, as I mentioned, for all intents and purposes, was the opposite. And you see after a few generations, there's some receptivity. The Sephardim are very popular. The impact of Harambam is very clear in southern France. You see a lot of philosophical works being produced. And one of the commentators, not even a commentator, the Hacham of the time in southern France, we have some of the notes and letters that he had produced because of this book that the ban is in. Crescas Vidal, he says, there are many Sephardi scholars of southern France who are completely familiar with the science of the Talmud. They were perpetual students, contributing new insights and interpretations, but in addition, were experts in the sciences. So we see slowly, not only are the Sephardim what they were in Andalusia, but they're bringing it with them now into southern France. And we're seeing more and more. There are letters showing that there are Ashkenazi scholars that are delving into the sciences. And we're getting a really holistic view of Torah in southern France developing. But it wasn't to last long. Well, not that it wasn't to last long. It wasn't to last long before it was challenged. So you had an individual, Abba Mari, who himself was actually quite interested into philosophy as an Ashkenazi in southern France. And he started to notice that there were some philosophical books coming out from the likes of Hacham Yaakov Anatoli, who wrote the Malmad HaTalmidim, which is, for all intents and purposes, the book in southern France for reading the parasha. It was the philosophical exposition, if you like, on the Torah. And in synagogues abound, this was the go-to book. It was the Covenant and Conversation of Rabbi Sachs of the medieval times. And Abba Mari started to see, hey, this Sephardi intrusion on our land with their philosophical and scientific viewpoint is going to lead the country into heresy. And there was a quote that he actually said, which was, those Jewish philosophers, they break the covenant by diminishing their Torah study. They please themselves with the children of strangers. They destroy the richness of the Torah. Some of them are submerged in logic. And I have seen men studying physics as well. So Abba Mari wasn't happy with the situation. He thought, what are we going to do about this? He thinks the whole land is going to be ridden with heretics. So he turned to, well, who else but the leading halachic authority, if you like, which was the Rashba. Now, it was very good for Abba Mari to reach out to the Rashba, who was in Catalonia. He wasn't even in southern France. Why was it good for him to reach out to Rashba? Because Rashba was not only a Sephardi, but he wasn't a fan of philosophy at all. He was very much of the Kabbalistic school of thought. And he held, just like you can see from the ban, the dangers of philosophy were very, very, very clear. So it was almost like a double-pronged benefit for Abba Mari to recruit the great Rashba in his attempt to stop this Sephardization of southern French Jewry. And when he reached out to Rashba actually responded, not wanting to get so involved. He was made aware by Abba Mari of the kind of books that were coming out, claiming that Abraham and Sarah represent form and matter. Again, very, very, very basic understanding of what Yaakov Anatoli had actually said. Obviously, Abraham and Sarah, he believed existed, but he believed there was a philosophical layer to what Abraham and Sarah represent. But again, people who are not very well versed in philosophical understandings, they take the literal meaning and they think this guy is saying that Abraham and Sarah didn't exist. So some of the issues we see in today's Judaism. But the Rashba was very interesting to note because he's a Sephardi, and I've just mentioned to you that Sephardim had this worldly outlook, who were philosophical and rational and intellectual. What happened? This goes back to what I said about the distinctive ideologies in Spain. Northern Spain was close, although on the border of the Franco-German Rhineland, which was Kabbalistic for all intents and purposes. And these two, Franco-German, this area of Franco-German Rhineland influenced so much the northern Spanish Jews, such as Rashba, because Rashba was taught by Ashkenazim, taught by Ramban, who was taught by Ashkenazim. So the two northern Spanish Sephardim were Ramban and Rashba, and they were very much the products of the Ashkenazi school of thought, which is why their outlook was distinct from the Andalusians, which was, if you like, I don't like to use the word pure, but the more authentic Sephardi approach, which believed in worldly knowledge. So that's why he recruited Rashba. And the Rashba on Tisha B'Av, it was July 29, 1305, in an assembly of the entire community on Shabbat in synagogue, the Barcelonian Jewish community. Remember, he's talking in Catalonia about a matter in Languedoc, which is its own issue. He got up and he went through this ban. I'd love to dig in more and go through exactly what the repercussions were and how they responded to this ban and what this ban really meant.
Amazing. I think this is such a wonderful and wow, kind of just not surprising, but like horrible insight into how kind of power plays and the struggles of being Jewish in various different contexts really affect how we practice Judaism. And I think the reason I say it's not surprising, because it's definitely unexpected to hear rabbis speaking like this, but I think it resonates so much today. I think we've seen so many times rabbis from various different spaces calling upon powers from different countries to kind of comment on the UK community or comment on other communities to create bans or to create discord in some way. It strikes me that it really is a consequence of the Sephardi community in Andalusia. They had some sense of privilege of being more free, I guess, than the people in Ashkenaz in Europe, and that really affects how they express themselves, and that just feels quite sad to me in terms of that is going to affect the full history of Judaism up till today. But let's talk about what the repercussions of bans like this are for us today. Rabbis are still shouting at each other and having this kind of rhetoric thrown out. What does this affect? How does this affect the Sephardi community today? How does it affect the Ashkenazi community and the Jewish community more generally?
It's a great question, very important question, very pertinent question. I think one thing we have to really consider is that there's always been different approaches in Judaism. But the idea is that there are limits to the differences, in the sense that at the end of the day, Torah is the blueprint, if you like, for Jewish life. And there are guidelines, there are limits, like there is with any other framework of existence out there. But there is a spectrum within that. As we know, there are 70 approaches to Torah. And what we've seen is bans historically occur as a result. If you try to really dig into it, it comes from good places. It really comes from a good place. At the end of the day, a lot of the people writing bans and going back and forth about it, it comes from, we'd hope, the commitment to representing the values of Torah and the message of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the most authentic way possible, and making sure that it stands on its own 2 feet. But the problem is, we know that good intentions sometimes have the most disastrous outcomes. And good intentions are not enough, because it's also important to be very well versed in the thing that you are attacking. And what's really, really fascinating is that if you take a survey of a lot of the bans or a lot of the statements that have come out against rabbis or against certain books, the more violent or the more loud those attacks are, the less that side of the argument knows or understands or empathizes or appreciates the knowledge base of the other side that they're critiquing. And you just see it. It's in a way beautiful, and it's sad, because you just think that, as you said, it's not as a result of Ashkenazi Hachamim, chas v'shalom. These were guys, they were giants. The contributions that they gave to Torah, and they have a valid viewpoint of living in isolation. In those days, they wanted to live like that. There are certain benefits to that I understand. But because of that isolation, they weren't able to understand some of the most beautiful elements of existence, such as philosophy and science, to try and get closer to God. Because remember, the Sephardim didn't see it in a way, and I'll say it because there's a difference between, some people might read this and think, this is very much like a modern Orthodox thing, where you've got, a reform, conservative, in the sense that, it's open to worldly knowledge. With the Sephardim, we don't have those titles, because with the Sephardim, Torah umada, Torah and science, they're not 2 separate things where you have to bridge the gap. The author of the world and the author of the Torah are one and the same, So therefore, the information, they're together. There are no gaps to bridge. It's just we haven't understood one or the other if we find any contradictions. So the bans come as a result of different worldviews and not really understanding the worldview. And I think the repercussions of it are that it means that we as a community, not the rabbinic leadership, but as a community, the lay people, if you like, we are at a loss, because what it means is we are more hesitant to study things that are worldly. At the end of the day, in many communities, the only authority is the rabbinic authority. And if you have that attitude towards worldly knowledge, it has an impact on you understanding worldly knowledge. And again, it's important to understand that it's not about you understanding worldly knowledge for the sake of knowing how biology works. It's connected to the love of God. If you love God, which is a halacha, and Harambam is posek, clear that the love of God is even stronger than the love you have for your partner, that you can't eat, that you can't drink, that you can't sleep because you're so infatuated with God. Rambam says you have to study his works, the Torah, and creation, science, nature, philosophy. So having these bans and these comments made against those who want to understand worldly knowledge as a way of getting closer to God is very, very different to banning worldly knowledge just because you shouldn't know biology, because you're essentially limiting the ability for a community member to build that apprehension of God and get closer to God through the things that he's putting out, which is nature, science, philosophy, art, music, beauty, etc. But this is the caveat, and it's an important one. There are limits. What is the context through which you are understanding these things? Because as we know, content is meaningless. A £5 note has no value. It's a piece of paper. It is the economic context that gives that data point, that £5 piece of paper, the value of being money. And it's the same thing with all these forms of knowledge. They are data points, but data in and of itself does not have inherent value. It is the insights that you gather from it. It's the context that you put, the lens through which you look at that data, which provides the insight. And it's the same thing with this worldly knowledge. What context are we looking into this? What context are we looking at this information through? And that's why the context of Torah is so important. And unfortunately, we've had throughout Jewish history, those who want to look at worldly knowledge and want to look at developments in the world, not through the lens of Torah, but through the lens of other ideologies, opinions, thought processes, which have caused a lot of the friction. But how you deal with the friction is the second point. Yeah. And I think when we go later into the response, we'll see how one of the leading thinkers of the time said how we should deal with differing opinions, which will answer the question in a much better way than I just did.
I think that's key, is how we deal with those differences is huge. We won't have time to go into the response today, but what I'm really interested to hear, I mean, it seems to me that what gets these bans to happen, what causes them to happen, is a lot of fear that my Judaism, or the rabbi who's making the bans, Judaism, is at risk here, or Judaism in general, if that's a thing, is at risk. And it seems like it's a lot of fear that makes people throw out these really, really angry statements. But what I want to know, in terms of, this was clearly at the time something that was a Sephardi and Ashkenazi issue. Today, it seems like, at least in the UK and the USA, that an Ashkenazi kind of isolationist perspective has influenced the whole Jewish community, including the Sephardi community, especially in Israel, where many Sephardim are akin to Haredim. So I wanted to ask how this impacts today's Sephardim, and where you think the future of Sephardi culture looks. What does it look like?
This is such a fundamental question. It's such a fundamental. It's the reason why I wrote the book. It's the reason why we've set up a Bet Midrash in London for Sephardim. It's huge, because at the end of the day, what's occurred is the response being, that we want to stop this, and anyone who doesn't study these things, as Sephardim said, will be excommunicated. That was the approach of Sepharad, and the impact has been that after the Enlightenment, after the expulsion in 1492 from Spain, the Spanish Jews left a thrive mode to go into survive mode, and the Ashkenazim were in survive mode, which is why they had that intellectual lacking. So then the Sephardim ended up having an intellectual lacking because they were no longer in thrive mode. Then the Medina, the state of Israel, was established, and we had a unification, a standardization of halacha, and a standardization of thought, outlook, and approach. So the Sephardi approach of worldly knowledge, of understanding the world around us and getting closer to God through it, and being open to developments in reality, has, for all intents and purposes, you've said, become mute. Rabbi Dweck, my Rebbe, recently in the Tradition Journal, wrote an article talking about post-Enlightenment Sephardi Jewry, and he says it better than I could say. He says classical Sephardi Judaism is becoming more and more of an endangered species, but things will change.
And I hope they do. I think it's so important to bring those voices from Andalusia into the community today, to speak about bringing worldly, scientific, philosophical, outside knowledge into our community to understand Torah and Judaism in a much more holistic and current way that reflects who we are as people right now. Thank you so much, Sina. This has been so quick. The conversation should last so much longer, but It Says What is a short, unexpected moment. But I hope this provides everyone in the audience online food for thought for Shabbat, and also for conversations about this type of issue going forward. You know, what does a ban look like today? How do we respond to it? But also, how do we raise the voices of cultures that have been somewhat silenced by Ashkenormativity in our communities, or by influences that are beyond our control? So I want to just say Shabbat Shalom to everyone, and thank you so much, Sina.
Thank you for having me. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.